Hey friends, thanks so much for joining us. This is a very important call. On the line we have our good friend Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Group. Harley, how are you?
I'm fine, Sean. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing well, and I want to thank you for arranging this very special call with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche's wife. Helga, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Hello. I want to thank you for joining us, Helga. Guys, this is an urgent call to discuss the situation in Ukraine. Most Americans probably are struggling to understand what's going on in Ukraine, and the Mockingbird media would have you believe that it's a revolution for good, a revolution for the good of the people. The LaRouche Group put out an important article. Lyndon LaRouche, in fact, put out an important article just the other day, which we carried at SGT Report, called Western Powers Back Neo-Nazi Coup in Ukraine. Now here's what I know. Putin's Russia is one of the last dominoes still standing against Western, American, British banking imperialism and colonialism. Now, if you guys will recall, back in 2008, Zygmunt Brzezinski and Dick Cheney's hand behind the Georgian attack of South Ossetia. It was a false flag attack, and only a very strong and immediate response from Putin forced the recall of that assault. At the time, Cheney blamed Russia and stated, quote, "Russian aggression must not go unanswered." This is a pattern we've seen time and time again, and the pattern is clear in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and Iran. Now, Ukraine? Soros is backing non-governmental organizations and protesters. And to me, Harley, when I say Soros, I mean the Rothschilds, because he is a Rothschild-connected agent. I'm going to turn it over to Harley to help us nurse the fundamentals on this thing, and then we're going to hear some details from Helga.
Well, Soros is also a Nazi collaborator from his youth when he was in Hungary. And he told CBS News 60 Minutes that those were the most exhilarating times of his life. So we're dealing with what we're really looking at is an orchestrated effort from the City of London and Wall Street to crush Russia, even if it risks thermonuclear war. I'm very happy for the opportunity to introduce your listeners to Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She's a very prominent political leader in Germany, and her primary role in recent years has been as an opponent of the genocidal policies of the financial oligarchy of this collapsing transatlantic system, which is based in the City of London and Wall Street. But at the same time, she's been a tireless campaigner for a new economic and cultural paradigm based on the best ideas of the golden renaissance of Europe as realized in our Declaration of Independence and Constitution and American economic system. In the last days, she's been engaged really in a global fight to stop Obama's imperial drive for war with Russia, which is using the Ukraine as a provocation for war, which could be a nuclear war. So Helga, you've been organizing this mobilization. Why don't you just give the listeners of SGT Report a picture of the danger and what must be done?
Well, as you, Sean, said in the beginning, the Western media are portraying the situation as if the freedom-loving people of Ukraine all of a sudden, have risen against the dictatorship of Yanukovych and the evil dictatorship of Putin. But, what triggered this was quite something different. At the recent EU summit in Vilnius, all of a sudden, Yanukovych decided not to sign a long-prepared European Union association agreement, which, if it would have been signed, would have integrated Ukraine immediately in the NATO structure. Now, if you look at the map, you can see that Ukraine is ranging or reaching deep into the territory of, what you could call the Russian heartland. And as a matter of fact, one time in history, Kiev was the capital of Russia. It also includes the access to the Black Sea at the Crimea, where the Russians have a very important port in Sevastopol. So if Ukraine would get under the command of NATO, it basically would leave Russia defenseless. That has been recognized by all strategists and think tanks, and they know it perfectly well. And therefore, one has to see this present development around Ukraine as part of the eastward expansion of NATO, which started practically after the collapse of the Soviet Union, despite the fact that it was one of the promises given to Helmut Kohl, who was Chancellor of Germany at the time, that there would be no eastward expansion, and that promise was broken. So what happened then after this cancelling of the EU association agreement in November was that foreign forces basically mobilized networks which were prepared since really 24 years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the people who are pro-West in the Ukraine, I mean, okay, there may be some people who have their own reasons why they want to be part of the European Union, but the majority of the people in Western Ukraine are people who have been organized systematically by 2,200 NGOs, financed by such organizations as the National Endowment of Democracy, the International Republican Institute, the equivalent Democratic Institute. And we have been following the situation in the Maidan, and there is no question that many of the demonstrators in the key place in Kiev receive $50 per day plus food for being there and demonstrating. And that has been the MO of George Soros in the Orange Revolution, which was using the same networks in 2004, by simply paying activists. And in a country which is so poor like Ukraine, it is not very difficult, to find young people and say, okay, you get a job, you get $50 a day, you get instruments, you get music band, you get pickets, you get buttons, and you will be equipped to demonstrate. And that way they have really organized people on the profile of being anti-Russian. This is unfortunately completely mixed with old Nazi networks, which existed in the Ukraine since the invasion by the Nazis in the 40s, where a certain Stepan Bandera prepared to help the Nazis to intervene in an underground operation. And some of these people remained and have children and whatnot. So that now you have several Nazi organizations in Ukraine. The most obvious one is the Svoboda party, but there are also many others who all refer back to the Stepan Bandera. And they have swastikas as their logo. If you look at their logo of their party, you can easily recognize this is swastikas. And in the recent period, there were at least 350 activists or terrorists who had been fighting on the side of Al-Qaeda in Syria.
In Syria, yes. I want to jump in and I want to bolster your point there, Helga. On page 2 of the Executive Intelligence Review, it said that according to one of the Ukrainian parliamentarians, 350 Ukrainians returning to the country from Syria in January 2014 after fighting with the Syrian rebels, including the Al-Qaeda-linked groups. Of course, we know that this government, the United States government, was backing the rebels. John McCain and his cronies were backing the rebels as the war drums beat for the United States to attack Syria. The only thing that kept us from doing that was that the American people, for the first time in my lifetime, rose up in droves and said, no, we will not take part in another war. And now some of those same paid rebels are being brought into the Ukraine to help in this uprising. Just to be clear, that's what you're saying, right?
Yes, exactly. And Mr. McCain was not too shy to be appearing on pictures, on photographs, together with Ole Ternabuk, who is the leader of the Svoboda party. And, they are now putting out the story, oh, yeah, these were Nazis in the past, but they have redeemed, and now they are no longer Nazis and they are no longer anti-Semites. But the reality is, these are not people who are pro-Europe. These are people who are hardcore. I wouldn't even call them nationalists. I would call them extreme chauvinists. they're xenophobic. They have put out statements against Jews, against Russians, against foreigners in general, against black people. This is Nazi. There is no question about it. And it's a complete scandal because, it's like in Syria where just because of the purpose of regime change, the United States and Europe, the EU are allying with people who are either Al-Qaeda terrorists or who are Nazis just for the purpose of regime change and the encirclement of Russia. And if this continues, this will end up in the short term in a thermonuclear war, and it's extremely dangerous. It must be stopped at all costs.
Well, let's talk about the big picture. Harley, maybe you can help us understand the big picture, because the encirclement of Russia, which Helga speaks of, is really at the core of the concern here. Now, just to level set for people, this NATO missile defense expansion in Central Europe is the key, correct? I mean, what they are doing, what the Western governments want, is the Ukrainian territory to help roll out this NATO missile defense expansion, which to the Russians would give NATO the opportunity for a first global strike, as you guys write in this executive intelligence review. Is that correct? And is that why we're worried about the possibility of thermonuclear global war?
Well, I think Helga can give you a really clear answer to that. But we had a report of a leading Russian general, General Leonid Ivashov, who basically said that for the Russians, they're already at war. This is already a war footing for them because they know what happened in World War II when the Nazis invaded. They know what it means to continue having NATO encroachments toward Russia with the idea of putting in a ballistic missile defense system to protect Europe from whom? I mean, here we are, we're negotiating with Iran to prevent them from developing nuclear weapons. Why do you need advanced placement missiles in Ukraine? And I think that this is one of the points that Mr. LaRouche has been emphasizing, and Helga also, that from a Russian standpoint, Americans have to think about what happened to Russia in World War II when they were our allies. And maybe, Helga, you could say something about that, because I think most Americans just don't get it.
Helga, help me understand, too. They're viewing this as very much an offensive against them.
Yes. I mean, there was a conference in Moscow, I think already 2 years ago, where the Russian Joint Chief of Staff produced video animations where they showed that the location of the U.S. missile defense system in Poland, in Romania, in Rota in Spain, because just yesterday or today, an Aegis destroyer, which is part of this missile defense system, arrived in this Navy base in Spain, and the Russians have said they cannot allow that phase 2, 3, and 4 will be finished, because there is a certain point where Russia becomes undefensible. Because again, if you look at the map, Poland is, in terms of the time a missile needs, maybe 3 minutes away from Moscow. And this is, in a certain sense, the same thing like the Cuban Missile Crisis was, or like the middle-range missile crisis of the 80s, where you had the Pershing II and the SS-20 being practically in launch on warning mode, with maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes away from each other. And the danger in this kind of situation is that when you get in that kind of a mode, where the one side has to fear that even the launching of one nuclear missile may be part of an overall attack, and that leaves them no other way than to initiate the basically attack of their entire arsenal. So we are back in that kind of a situation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but this time with a huge thermonuclear potential. And, in a certain sense, it is so bad that if we don't stop, there comes in a very short period of time where both sides, the West, NATO, the United States, and naturally the other nuclear forces, Britain, France, and so forth, on the one side, and Russia and China on the other side, will go to a first strike simultaneously. because, the danger comes from this utopian conception that, which developed with the prompt global strike doctrine and the air-sea battle doctrine in the Pacific, that it would be possible to take out the nuclear capability of any opponent without the danger of radioactive fallout. There were articles in the, Air Force Journal and other expert media, which is the idea that mutual assured destruction, which used to be the doctrine of NATO, is no longer valid because new technologies and new weapons have been developed so that you can, penetrate, the defense of the opponent, take out their arsenals, and basically, leave them defenseless. Now, both Russia and China have made absolutely clear that that is not the case. As a matter of fact, in October, all the Chinese media in one day published maps which showed that they have strategic submarines, 70 of them, which are nuclear capable, and they can destroy the entire west coast of the United States, where the radioactive fallout would go all the way till Chicago, and then they have a second route through the North Pole, where ICBMs would hit the East Coast. Now, that was a clear answer by China. And a similar statement has been made by Russia, where they said that if the US missile defense system goes beyond a certain point, and that point may have been reached with this Aegis destroyer sent to Spain, that they will have to even go to a first strike because they cannot wait until they are defenseless. Now, this is where this Ukraine situation comes in, because there was a statement, a memorandum issued yesterday by the ISBOS group, which is a group of intellectuals close to Putin and Glaziev and so forth. Glaziev is a member of it, and they basically said there is a plan whereby they want to drive out the Russian population out of Ukraine. They want to integrate it into NATO. They want to kick out the Russians from the Sevastopol base in the Black Sea, and then drive on the so-called Maidan process into Russian cities. Now, that means regime change not only for Ukraine, but regime change for Russia. And there was an article about 2 weeks ago in the Financial Times where they said, people in Ukraine should drive out Yanukovych, and then the people in Russia should take that as an aspiration to drive out Putin. Now, I can tell you one thing, with the Russian experience, with the Great Patriotic War, defeating Napoleon before, and then defeating the Nazi invasion, there is no way how Russia will capitulate. And therefore, we are looking at the short-term showdown, and we were talking today to military people in Europe, and they said, well, remember that the Russian reaction came to the provocations by Saakashvili in Georgia in 2008, when he tried to muddy the waters in Ost Ossetia. At the end of the Beijing Olympic Games, Putin intervened in East Ossetia. And therefore, the likelihood is that once the Sochi Olympic Games are over, Russia may react in respect to the Ukraine is in a similar way. Now, I would warn very strongly to say that is a security, because the provocations in Ukraine are such that Putin may not even wait until the end of the Olympic Games. There are already calls, by the parliament of the Southeast Asian provinces in Ukraine, calling on the Russian Federation to come into Ukraine and protect the Russian population. Now, that means the fuse to World War III is already lit. And what happened is, then Victoria Nuland, when this YouTube tape, the tape of her conversation with the ambassador Pyatt was put on YouTube.
Is this the one where she said F the EU?
Yes. And, this woman seems to have quite a sexual appetite if she wants to do that to the entire European Union, I mean, she is a piece of work. I mean, remember that she was an advisor of Cheney. She's married to Robert Kagan. And Robert Kagan, in the old Bush administration, that is Bush Senior, was one of the architects of this policy, namely the New American Century Doctrine.
Right.
And that has been the idea. You see, this is the tragedy of the whole thing, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, there would have been the chance to really, develop a peace order for the 21st century.
That's right.
There was no enemy. One could have really said, okay, now let's order world affairs in such a way that all people on this planet can peacefully work together for the common aims of mankind. And we at that time had this program, which turned into the Eurasian Land Bridge and the whole new Silk Road and so forth. So there was a plan. Mr. LaRouche and I worked on this perspective, to have a peace order. But unfortunately, at that point, the neocons in the Bush administration decided to go in the direction of an empire, to build an empire based on the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States, and then basically conquer the rest of the world through regime change against all countries which would not submit.
That's right.
Yes.
And, that's right. And I just want to add that in the Project for a New American Century, they essentially outlined their plan to use terrorism, a boogeyman, an Osama bin Laden type figure, to catalyze the American people to back these imperial efforts that otherwise the American people would never have backed. We would not have gone into Afghanistan, Iraq, or anywhere else had it not been for the events of 9/11. But go on.
Yeah, and look at the result of this policy. I mean, look at Iraq today. I mean, I'm not a friend of Saddam Hussein, but if you look at Iraq today, the country is destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
But every day you have bombings, it's bombed back in the Stone Age.
Yep.
People are desperate. The country is destroyed. Look at Libya.
Mm-hmm.
Libya is now torn apart by war between tribes and clans and whatnot. It's a not livable place anymore. Afghanistan is much, much, much worse than the media admit. We are in contact with, German soldiers who have come back, and they basically say the place is already now run by a security force of Afghanistan, which was trained by the US and NATO, and they are terrorizing the local population. And once the US troops and NATO troops will leave, the place will go back fully into a Taliban and other nightmare.
Well, Helga, as you probably know, opium production in Afghanistan under the Taliban was at an all-time low, and under the U.S. military, it's at an all-time high. There's now such a heroin problem in this country, in the United States, that it's creeping into the most unsuspecting suburbs, even suburbs not far from where we live. And, of course, Philip Seymour Hoffman just succumbed to his addiction to easy-to-find heroin on the streets of New York. It's all coming into this country now, and it's all being guarded. The growth of it's being guarded by the U.S. military. Let me ask you this. What is driving this madness? I know that the LaRouche Group is demanding the immediate impeachment of Barack Obama, and that's certainly a good idea. But if we know Zygmunt Brzezinski was, behind Carter, and he's one of the architects of this, the grand chessboard, how do we stop this madness?
Well, I think, the only way to stop it really, what the Americans do with their president, that's up to them. As you can hear, I'm not an American, so I'm not going to comment on that. But, the one thing which is very clear, the drive towards empire has to stop. And we have to go back to the best traditions of the American history: Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Quincy Adams, Alexander Hamilton, Lincoln, the idea that the United States must be part of an alliance of perfectly sovereign republics. And, that is eminently feasible, because if the United States would go back to the tradition of the American Revolution and say, we cooperate with the countries of Eurasia, of Europe, of Africa, of Latin America, to eradicate the drug trade, to stop the casino economy. I mean, look, There was a report just, I think, 2 weeks ago that 85 individuals have as much property as 3.5 billion people have.
That's right.
Now that doesn't make any sense. I mean, you can eat caviar until it comes out of your ears. You can drive Porsches, which in the United States is ridiculous anyway with your 65-mile speed limit.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a limit to what you can enjoy as privilege.
My friend Richard Grove refers to these people as intraspecies kleptoparasites. And I think that's what they are. They just want more and more and more, and it's never enough to fill the void.
Yeah, but this has to stop. Look, I mean, we have right now dying continents. Africa is dying every day. Thousands and thousands of people are drowning in the Mediterranean, which is becoming an ocean of blood and misery and corpses because people are running away from poverty and hunger in Africa, in Syria. They're building now walls in Greece, at the border of Greece, at the border of Romania, because they want to stem the flood of refugees coming from Africa and the Middle East. How long do you think this will continue? We are right now at the short fuse of a collapse of the transatlantic system, because you see what happened was there was this debate in the Federal Reserve for quite some time that you could not stop the quantitative easing, because if you stop pumping money into the system, then the bubble would collapse. And there was a big debate. You cannot get out of it because once you stop pumping money, the bubble will explode. Now, because this has built up a hyperinflationary, tremendous bubble, now basically they started the so-called tapering by reducing the liquidity injection from 85 to first 75 billion a month. Now they have, brought it down to 65 billion. And what do you see? You see the collapse of the emerging markets, currencies. You see a tremendous capital flight out of the emerging markets back into the so-called safe havens like the United States. And as a result, you are really at the verge of a blowout of the system. And the Bank of International Settlement, which is the central bank of all central banks, just put out, I think a week ago, a statement that this tapering, i.e. reducing the money pumping, is extremely dangerous and may cause a blowout of the system. And I think that is why this war danger is being accelerated, because you have people in this oligarchical financial empire who say, rather than we let the Asian countries prosper, we take down everybody, even if it destroys ourselves. And that is why my husband has been emphatic that Glass-Steagall, the separation of the banks, exactly like Franklin D. Roosevelt did it in 1933, is the necessary first step. Without there can be no solution, because you have to stop this casino, and you have to then, as a first step, have Glass-Steagall write off many of the unpayable debt. If Wall Street is forced to bring their books in order without money pumping and taxpayer money, many of them will have to close down, and that's not a loss because they are not financing the real economy anyway. Then as the next step, we need a credit system, and then we have to build the reconstruction of the world economy. And we have been working on that for decades, really. We have developed a program of the so-called World Land Bridge, which is many projects. For example, NAWAPA, the North American Water Management Project, which would immediately create anywhere between 4 and 6 million jobs in the United States. It would start to overcome the drought in Texas, in California, which is becoming a real serious problem. Farmers are losing their cattle because they can't feed it anymore. Mm-hmm. There is an increasing shortage of food developing. In Mexico, you have droughts. So we have to combine this NAWAPA with the building of the Bering Strait tunnel between Alaska and Siberia. We have to go into the Eurasian land bridge development and many, many other projects, especially water projects, because there is a tremendous shortage of water in the Middle East, in Africa, in the western states of the United States, in the north of China. So there are clearly defined projects. We could end that and we could go immediately in the direction what Franklin D. Roosevelt did with the New Deal, the Tennessee Valley Authority program, and there is no reason why we have to crash civilization against the wall, which may be now 2 weeks ago. So if you have any way of mobilizing your audience, your viewers, your listeners, please tell them they must first start to get the story about Ukraine right, that this is a Nazi coup aimed at encircling Russia and forcing a showdown with Russia. And secondly, we need Glass-Steagall right away, or else this thing will explode. And once you have an uncontrolled collapse of the financial system, for example, Thomas Hoening, who is the vice chairman of the FDIC, has put out several times warnings that if it now comes to a situation like Lehman Brothers in 2008, it will not be one too big to fail, it will be the entire system coming down. And if that happens, they have no tools to remedy that, because the outstanding derivative debt is $1.4 quadrillion.
Right.
And even if you do bailout, bail-in, quantitative easing, it's not going to solve that problem. And therefore, you are in danger of plunging into an immediate financial collapse.
Well, Helga, I sure do. We sure do value your time and very much appreciate your expertise in these areas. Harley, I was just kind of wondering, as I'm processing all this, what your thoughts are on the end game for this missile defense shield that they are hell bent on rolling out. Joel Skousen at the World Affairs Brief has talked about for a very long time his belief that it is the goal of the elite for this country to go to nuclear war with Russia and China. And it's hard to not believe that when you see them pushing and pushing and pushing so hard against Russia. What is your take here on the end game? What are they? Do they want thermonuclear war with Russia? Is that the goal?
Well, I think Helga explained that the key is if it's the après nous le déluge view, that if we can't control it, we're willing to let the whole thing blow.
Yeah.
And this has been the policy since the 1890s, when Bismarck was overthrown in Germany, when the British started organizing the beginnings of World War I with the Japanese and the Germans to fight against the Russians, and to fight the Germans, fight the French, to break up the world. Basically what we're looking at is an end game. But I think the important thing is we're dealing with a situation in which the banks are bankrupt. Everyone says, well, you can't beat them. They're too powerful. They're not too powerful. They're very ignorant. They can't run an economy. And the only thing is that we have to use the constitutional power to remove the problem. And the problem right now is that we have a puppet of this empire in the presidency. And maybe Helga can't say it because she's not an American, but I can. And Mr. LaRouche has been emphatic on this. Obama has to go. The fact that he's still in there is an existential threat to the life of every single person in America. And so your listeners have a responsibility to give up the pessimism and the cynicism and the defeatism and do what we did to stop the war with Syria. Only this time, let's not just stop a war, let's get rid of the cause of the war.
Very well said. Helga, do you have any final words for our audience before we lose you?
No, I just would urge people to really, mobilize themselves like never before, because, see, the biggest problem I see is that, there are many articles now about the 100 years anniversary of World War I and how people were sleepwalking into it and didn't really understand, and then it turned out this horrible meat grinder of people fighting each other in the trenches, 4 years, the Germans against the French, back and forth, only a few meter back and forth, killing. This time, it will not be like that. This time, we are really looking at the potential extinction of mankind. Because if you look at the thermonuclear arsenal, and the idea that you can take out the arsenal of the opponent is completely insane. Because what do you have? You have missiles, nuclear missiles, warheads on strategic submarines, the Ohio class. You have them in strategic bombers. You have them hidden in places, in mountains and whatnot. But you have such overkill thermonuclear potential that once you get into a situation where both sides use these weapons, there will be nobody left.
That's right.
And when Kennedy, in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, said, that the people who are dying in the first hours in nuclear war will be the happy ones, as compared to those who die a few weeks later, because the dying will be much more horrible. That is, that was mild compared to what we are looking today. The chance that we would, as a civilization and as a species, survive this is zilch. And that is what people should think about. There is a movie on our website, LaRouche PAC, called Unsurvivable, and we made that movie so that people really are reminded of what a nuclear war would mean. And if you want to do anything for yourself, your children, your grandchildren, watch that movie, think about it, and then act, because this Congress is not in the real world. They had this vote 2 days ago where they voted something like 350 to 2 to back this opposition in the Ukraine. And we talked to many congressmen afterwards, and many of them said, oh, we thought it's just the peace-loving people of Ukraine. They had no idea. And the US media has, unlike the German media, where at least some mainstream media had big reports about the Nazis in the Maidan, and Time magazine and the Guardian, they did have articles about this. There was no mainstream article in the United States, and there were these congressmen who are extremely parochial. Many of them don't even have a passport. They voted for something which they don't even understand. So please get the message around and tell your audience that they should mobilize to change it, because it's still time to stop it, but the time is running out quickly.
That's right. Well, now you guys know Ukraine is the hair trigger for thermonuclear war, and if you want to learn more, you can certainly visit LaRouchePAC.com. And our guests have been Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and she's the wife of Lyndon LaRouche, and also Harley Schlanger, the national spokesperson for LaRouche PAC. Helga, it's been a real honor to speak with you, and I want to thank you for your service to humanity.
Well, I'm happy to speak to you and everybody else.
Harley, thank you so much for your time.
All right, John, we'll be in touch.
All right.
Thank you very much for having us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. God bless.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.